Hello and welcome. It's been a couple of weeks since I did my last video. Pretty busy doing other things. Uh, but I've been thinking quite a lot about the present situation with regards the COVID 1984 scenario that many people are living through. A lot of the liberties and freedoms we had before March in the UK seem to have disappeared in many respects. I was looking forward to going to Moscow in Siberia this year for a couple of conferences, psychotherapy conferences. And the first conference I was invited to speak at was the 9th World Congress for Psychotherapy in Moscow, 26th of 29th of June. Because of the lockdown, I was stopped from going. And then there was another conference in Siberia on the Chinese-Kazakhstan border, where I was going to speak at a series of workshops. So it was very disappointing not to go with colleagues from all over the world to discuss the very important topic of the conference, which was children, society and the future, the planet of psychotherapy. That was what the title of the conference was in Moscow. And my title of talk for the Congress was How the West Was Lost for the Children. From R.D. Laing, The Dialectics of Liberation, and Sexual 2, to Not Heeding the Warnings, to the West, from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Identity Politics, Political Correctness, and the Murder of God. And I'll just read you out the abstract. Children, society, and the future are under attack from forces which are far from benign. Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned, be more careful from falsely using the struggle for peace and for social justice to lead you down a false road. Perhaps the West is being led down a false road. From the heady and hopeful 1960s of R.D. Laing, Critical Psychiatry, and the Dialectics of Liberation, Sexual Liberation too, the West, like Solzhenitsyn prophetically warned, is now straining under the cosh of identity politics, political correctness, and an insidious brand of social justice, queer theory, and gender ideology. This ideology is being pushed into children's nurseries and primary schools, along with society-wide enforcements upon free speech. People are scared to speak against this new justice. The Western intellectual fascination with communism, e.g. R.D. Laing's Dialectics of Liberation, Sartre, Badiou, Derrida, has morphed into a godless, hypersexed religion of queer theory-inspired social justice. Should we heed the words of Solzhenitsyn? Men have forgotten God. That is why all this has happened. In the West, the cult of queer theory has permeated into politics, education, and psychotherapy. Its modus operandi contra reproductive futurism, where the only law is the legal one, where the state is the master arbiter of justice. But as Solzhenitsyn argued, a society with no other scale than the legal one is not quite worthy of man either. A society which is based on the letter of the law and never reaches any higher is taking very scarce advantage of the high level of human possibilities. The possibilities of the future, of society and our children are being attacked through the letter of a stunted and reductive law that promises unlimited possibilities and immediate rewards. The psychotherapy of life in the clinic needs to heed another scale other than a legal one to resurrect a future for everyone, especially for our children. Now, I wrote this abstract way back before March, before COVID 1984, and with regards some of the things that have happened as a result of lockdown and the lockdown measures, people's lives have been very drastically changed. Children are in schools having to wear masks for COVID-19. Children are having to social distance. They are now ensconced in a world where Operation Fear permeates every aspect of daily living. And so, like the title of the Congress, Children's Society in the Future, like Solzhenitsyn, that conference in Moscow is very pertinent, and even more so now. And just the other evening, I said I've been busy with other things. I was talking at a psychotherapy group in Scotland on their annual general meeting, and I gave a talk after the meeting. So there's a fly here bothering me, a spider of some kind. So I was preparing a talk for this group. And I'll just give you a little quote of what I said to this group in this meeting. We have had well over 100 years of psychotherapy, and echoing James Hillman, the world is not getting any better. How many kinds of psychotherapy are there? 300? 400? Some might say that the rise of therapeutic culture, the cultural hegemony of mental health, the fetishization and fashion for mental health, has made a lot of things worse. As cultural theorists E. Michael Jones and Christian writers like Seraph and Rose have pointed out, the effects of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in the Western world, whilst undoubtedly adding to Western civilization, has added to the domination, especially in recent decades, the ideological creep of a humanistic modus operandi. That is, a world where God is dead, or at least killed, or is less and less present. And whilst not meaning to put forward a religious dogmatic stance, the sensibility of a spiritual or religious orientation, as opposed to a nihilistic atheist one, which is now present and more dominant in all walks of life, leads the psychic geography towards a place where man is God, the Superman in the Nietzschean sense. But this situation comes with the price, whether one is religious or not. And the point of my talk the other night was highlighting what Solzhenitsyn warned about to the West, when his warnings to the West was that we had forgotten God, and the terrible things that happened in the Soviet Union would come to the West. And Solzhenitsyn said this in one of his very famous speeches. In his Templeton Prize lecture in 1983, entitled Godlessness, the first step to the Gulag, he says, since then I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of people's testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God, and that is why all this has happened. And there's several other quotes which I could go into, but for the sake of time, I won't. Because it relates to a lot of the other things I've talked about in my other videos about the rise in technology in society, kind of technological way of looking at our life, kind of suffering, and trying to use technology and such like to alleviate such suffering. And as you can see from the COVID 1984 shenanigans, what's going on at the moment, this, whether you believe in it, this is some sort of conspiracy or not, the huge push for a technological stroke medical solution to this problem is more and more dominant. And in some sense, this represents a killing of God, a dying away of God in our consciousness, of a transcendent, of an idea that not everything can be fixed through man's means, through the Superman in the Nietzschean sense. And this is pertinent because the use of technology in medicine to cure man's ills is not a benign thing, especially when it comes to human being in the Heideggerian sense of being. Because if we overlay too much of the medical and technological on the way we live and think, it raises something quite fundamental, which I hope to explain. I came across a video on YouTube, and I'll leave the link below. Now, I don't know anything about people who made this video or anything like that, but I thought it was interesting. It was people who had taken part, so it was a report on people who had taken part in the COVID-19 vaccine trials. And something, my ears pricked up when I heard this. Some of the people who'd taken part in the trial said that they felt that after they taken the vaccine in the trial, they felt this idea that they've killed God. The vaccine had killed God in them. They could not feel God anymore. This is very interesting, I think, because there's lots of debate on all sides of this argument regarding the COVID-19 vaccine, that of the physical effects of it, the positive effects of it for immunity, affecting symptoms, etc. And then the negative side effects, transverse myelitis, which is some sort of spinal thing that a few people have reported where they had problems with the spinal cord and were left paralysed, and I'm not sure they've recovered completely yet. But there's a lot of debate regarding the physical effects, side effects, positive effects, negative effects. What we haven't heard, though, which is highly interesting, strange, we've not heard anything about the psychological effects of this vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine. How do people feel in their experience after taking this vaccine? And that, for some, you might think, well, is it an important thing? Well, we can revisit recent history to look at the development of antidepressants, specifically the SSRI branch of antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which my PhD research was concerned with, actually. But from what I recall from my research then, and it's far more known now, that some SSRI antidepressants caused what's called emotional numbing. Some people couldn't feel either happiness or sadness, and it was an intolerable sensation not to feel the whole range of human emotions: sadness, grief, boredom. It induced in many people this kind of no man's land of feeling, of nothingness. Some people craved to feel sadness, to feel their emotion, to feel depressed. Now, I'm not decrying anyone for taking antidepressants. From the whole of human history, people have taken pharmaceutical elements, drugs, etc., to alleviate pain, suffering on a psychic level, and experimented with drugs to change their state of mind. So this is not a judgment. Some people do need to take SSRI antidepressants, but it does raise the fundamental question of what is it about human experience of being that necessitates or highlights the importance of feeling, especially pertaining to the religious. I mean, this is a big question. Do we have to have all our faculties in place to be truly in touch with being, or truly in touch with God or the transcendent? Many people, many therapists, for example, find that people who take antidepressants during psychotherapy, the psychotherapy isn't as effective because there's something missing from the conversation that the patient on antidepressants is not truly in touch with parts of themselves. And that, I could concur with that. It's some people are disconnected in some way because of the pharmaceutical interventions. That's not to say that it's possible to come back and regain that. Some people, we never return to that, of course. So this medical and technological drive regarding COVID-19 and regarding human suffering through pharmaceutical means is an interesting topic. And it's an interesting topic because Aldous Huxley, in his essay Brave New World Revisited, touched upon this. Because as many people recall, the Brave New World highlighted a society where people were taking soma, some sort of drug, to keep them anesthetized, to keep them functioning, to live. And so I'll just read a little bit of what Huxley says in his Brave New World Revisited essay. That a dictator could, if he so desired, make use of these drugs for political purposes is obvious. He could insure himself against political unrest by changing the chemistry of his subjects' brains, and so make them content with servile condition. You could use tranquilizers to calm the excited, stimulants to arouse enthusiasm in the indifferent, hallucinogens to distract the attention of the wretched from their miseries. But how, it may be asked, will the dictator get his subject to take the pills that will make them think, feel, and behave in the ways he finds desirable? In all probability, it will be enough merely to make the pills available. Today, alcohol and tobacco are available, and people spend considerably more on these very unsatisfactory euphorics, pseudostimulants, and sedatives than they are ready to spend on the education of their children. Or consider the barbiturates and tranquilizers. In the United States, these drugs can be obtained only on a doctor's prescription. But the demand of the American public for something that will make life in an urban, industrial environment a little more tolerable is so great that doctors are now writing prescriptions for the various tranquilizers at the rate of 48 million a year. I'll just say this, people should check up the rate of antidepressant prescriptions that have skyrocketed since March when the COVID-19 restrictions came in. It'll be very worth looking at. So Huxley goes on. Moreover, a majority of these prescriptions are refilled. 100 doses of happiness are not enough. Send to the drugstore for another bottle, and when that is finished, for another. There can be no doubt that if tranquilizers could be bought as easily and cheaply as aspirin, they would be consumed, not by the billions, as they are at present, but by the scores and hundreds of billions. And a good cheap stimulant would be almost as popular. Under a dictatorship, pharmacists would be instructed to change their tune with every change of circumstances. In times of national crisis, it would be their business to push the sale of stimulants. Between crises, too much alertness and energy on part of his subjects might prove embarrassing to the tyrant. At such times, the masses would be urged to buy tranquilizers and vision producers. Under the influence of these soothing syrups, they could be relied upon to give their master no trouble. As things now stand, the tranquilizers may prevent some people from giving enough trouble, not only to the rulers, but even to themselves. Too much tension is a disease, but so is too little. There are certain occasions when we ought to be tense, when an excess of tranquility, and especially of tranquility imposed from the outside by a chemical, is entirely inappropriate. Very true. And I'll just end at this part here. He says, meanwhile, pharmacology, biochemistry, and neurology are on the march, and we can be quite certain that in the course of the next few years, new and better chemical methods for increasing suggestibility, lowering psychological resistance will be discovered. Like everything else, these discoveries may well be used well or badly. They may help the psychiatrist in his battle against mental illness, or they may help the dictator in his battle against freedom. More probably, since science is divinely impartial, they will both enslave and make free, heal, and at the same time destroy. Thought-provoking words from Aldous Huxley. Very thought-provoking. The rise of the technological and the medical in society regarding this supposedly killer COVID-19, by all accounts from lots of different scientists, is not as dangerous as the governments are making out. So returning back to this idea of the COVID-19 vaccine, what does it entail? What are the psychological effects of this vaccine? And we all already have the vast mass prescriptions of antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs on the population, especially since March and the COVID-19 regulations came into place in the Coronavirus Act. So what is going on? Human suffering, as I said, is people who've taken antidepressants who were plunged into a world where there was no suffering, no happiness, no sadness, no joy, no boredom, just a nothingness. Highlights something quite interesting because in the Bible, the Christian Bible, which some people regard as what is a fine example of psychology, and there's a lot in it. I think there's a lot of Christian existentialists, for example, take on board these hints and advice from the Bible regarding the necessity of suffering. I'll just give you a few quotes from the Bible, which I think are interesting. This is Peter, chapter 5, verse 10. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. And another one, Timothy 3, verse 12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. Think about that one in regards power of medicine, doctors, psychiatry, and people who are suffering or in mental suffering want to forego getting rid of their suffering, are sometimes forced against their will to be medicated. Is that a form of persecution in some sense? This is James chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. We'll also do one more. Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 13. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Now, what I'm trying to get at with those quotes from the Bible is that the value in suffering, not in a romantic sense of we should just not help people who are suffering or not try to bear that suffering in some way where we can come to better days. But in the idea of being a human, in the Heideggerian sense of being, what is the importance of experiencing this full range of human emotions, away from some sort of Nietzschean Superman sense of trying to control everything. Now, in this talk I gave to the psychotherapy group the other evening, I highlighted this idea that the technological in relation to psychotherapy of an outcome of trying to get a person from A to B, from a state of unhappiness to B, a state of happiness, is it's fool's gold. It's often the trick. It's not really a trick, it's based on many, many great philosophers' ideas and religious and spiritual people's ideas. There's no cure, in a sense, for the human condition. As those quotes in the Bible pointed out, that there's no fear of suffering. So in a psychotherapy or a psychoanalysis based on these kind of ideas, and I wrote about it in my book, The Testimony of Experience, a real person who, quite a while, had been in psychoanalysis. Before this time, they had tried every form of treatment for their depression, antidepressants, cognitive behavioral therapy, all types of therapies, mindfulness, etc. All with the desire for an outcome to get happiness, this state, this kind of place of happiness. And it was only after a good long while being in psychoanalysis where the therapist or the analyst was not providing this outcome, not striving for it in any way, but letting the person talk, explain, repeating, working out, just like Freud says in his lectures on psychoanalysis. The person realised after a while that there's actually no cure. There was no cure for this condition. All this searching had been in vain. That this hyper striving in a Superman sense to conquer the human being of misery, listlessness, of boredom, of angst was all the problem itself. Now people might say, well, it's terrible, but they're still left depressed. No. What happened was the person suddenly entered into a different state of being. They were relieved from this search and they became liberated. So the fact that there was no cure became the cure. This is the paradox. And I think this kind of paradox is highlighted very well in the Bible. This idea of patience on Jesus and the cross. If you bear this suffering, you'll be redeemed. And Heidegger talked about this, of course, as well. He said that trying to soothe people's ills with technological, medical means, in that sense, will trip you up. So, in conclusion, what's going on at the moment in our COVID-1984 times? On the one hand, you have the government scientists saying we all have to have vaccine, we have to have masks and social distancing. In many sense, all these measures, they take away, in many sense, our sovereignty as human beings to meet, to transact, to suffer even our fear of death. Because the government are saying you you can't go out to do normal things like you used to because there is the fear of death. Of course, we're all going to die. And the risk of death, by the looks of the data, is extremely, extremely small. And these medicines they want to give us to cure our ills, the antidepressants, the psychiatric drugs, and the vaccine as well. Does this vaccine alter our psychology? Does it take us away from fully experiencing what it is to be human or being? Do people who take this vaccine, for example, do they feel this psychic numbness? They can't feel their soul. They feel dead in some way, very similar to the SSRIs. I think it's something to explore. But in the religious realm, in commentators regarding what's happening in society now, is this a fight against good and evil? I mean, if we're being deprived of feeling suffering or of facing our death in some way due to technological or medical ways, is it taking us away from this place, as discussed in the Bible, where we can fully experience suffering? It reminds me of this idea of common law, the sovereignty of an individual, to have autonomy in the world. Do not accept diktats from government that you have to do this, that, and the other. You have a right to live your life as you please within regulations of self-governance. Taking medicines if you want to take medicines, of working if you want to work. Some people would say that the tyrannical diktats of the government are taking away this sovereignty. And one could think, well, they're also taking away the sovereignty of being, like Heidegger talked about. So lots of questions. I'm going to end here now. See you next time. Take care of yourselves.